The blood on Harrison Everett's hands would not wash away no matter how hard he scrubbed them in the creek. And when he finally looked up at the woman standing on the bank watching him with those steady gray eyes, he realized she had been there for some time. The year was 1878, and Lewiston, Idaho was the kind of place where a man could disappear into the timber camps and logging operations that dotted the Clearwater River Valley, where the mountains rose up like sentinels and secrets stayed buried under pine needles and morning frost. Harrison had come here 6 months ago to escape memories that chased him across 3 states, but ghosts had a way of catching up no matter how far a man ran. Penelope Sutton did not flinch at the sight of him kneeling in the shallow water with his shirt torn and his knuckles split open. She was 22 years old and had lived in Lewiston her entire life, the daughter of a freight merchant who had died when she was 16. Leaving her with a warehouse full of supplies and a head for business that most men found unsettling. Her dark hair was pinned up in a practical bun, and she wore a simple brown dress that showed she had been working, not socializing. She carried a basket over one arm filled with medicinal herbs she had been gathering along the riverbank. "You are hurt," she said simply, and her voice carried across the water like something solid he could hold on to. Harrison was 24 and had been a cowboy before he became a logger, moving cattle from Texas up through the territories until the day everything went wrong. He stood up slowly, water dripping from his hands, and for a moment he considered lying to her. But there was something in her face that made dishonesty seem impossible, a clarity that cut through his defenses like winter wind through a worn coat. "Got into a fight at the lumber camp," he said, his voice rough. "Man accused me of stealing from his gear. I did not do it, but he would not listen." "Did you kill him?" Penelope asked, and there was no judgment in the question, only a need to know the truth. "No," Harrison said, and relief flooded through him as he said it. "But I wanted to. I wanted to so badly that it scared me more than anything he could have done to me." She nodded as if this made perfect sense, then gestured toward the bank. "Come out of the water before you catch cold. I have supplies that will help with those cuts." He waded out slowly, suddenly aware of how he must look to her, this rough man with violence written across his body and shame burning in his chest. But Penelope simply set down her basket and began pulling out small cloth bundles, unwrapping them with practiced efficiency. She had him sit on a fallen log while she cleaned his knuckles with water from a canteen, then applied a salve that smelled of pine and something sharper, maybe yarrow. "You are shaking," she observed, and her fingers were gentle on his damaged hands. Harrison tried to stop the tremors running through him, but they only grew worse. It was not the fight that had broken something loose inside him. It was what the fight had stirred up, memories of another time when his fists had flown and someone had not gotten back up. He had been 19, working a ranch in Colorado, and there had been a card game that went bad and accusations flying, and his brother Tommy caught in the middle of it. Harrison had thrown the first punch trying to defend Tommy's honor, and in the chaos that followed, a man had pulled a gun. Tommy had stepped in front of Harrison, taken the bullet meant for him, and died in the dirt outside a saloon while Harrison held him and screamed. The shaking became full tremors, and then Harrison felt something crack open inside his chest, something he had been holding closed with both hands for 5 years. A sound came out of him that was not quite human, a grief so raw it tore at his throat. Tears came next, hot and unwanted, streaming down his face while his shoulders heaved with the force of memories he could not outrun. He expected her to pull away, to make some excuse, and leave him to his breakdown in private. That was what decent people did, gave you space to fall apart where no one had to watch. But Penelope did not move away. Instead, she shifted closer, and then her arms were around him, pulling his head down to her shoulder. She held him while he cried, one hand moving in slow circles on his back, her voice low and steady as she murmured words he could not quite make out, but that soothed something wild in him anyway. "It is all right," she said when he tried to pull away, ashamed of the tears soaking into her dress. "You do not have to be strong right now. Just let it out." So he did. Harrison cried in her arms like he had not cried since the day they buried Tommy in a Colorado grave, and he felt no shame because she offered him none. She simply held him, this woman he did not know, and gave him permission to break without judgment. The afternoon light filtered through the pines, and the river rushed over stones, and Harrison let himself grieve everything he had been carrying alone. When the tears finally stopped, he pulled back slowly, unable to meet her eyes. His face felt swollen and his chest ached, but there was also a strange lightness, as if he had set down a weight he had been hauling uphill for years. "I am sorry," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Do not be," Penelope said firmly. She pulled a handkerchief from her pocket and handed it to him. "Tears are not something to apologize for. They are just proof that you loved something enough for it to hurt when it was gone." Harrison wiped his face, studying her more carefully now. She had a strong jaw and high cheekbones, and her gray eyes held something he could not quite name. Not pity exactly, but understanding that ran deeper than sympathy. This was a woman who knew about loss, he realized. She had her own ghosts. "How did you know?" he asked. "That I was not just some violent drunk who deserved to be left alone." Penelope considered this while she repacked her basket. "I did not know for certain," she admitted. "But I have learned to trust what I see in people's eyes. Yours were hurting long before that fight today." Violence born from pain looks different than violence born from cruelty. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the river and the wind in the trees. Harrison felt stripped bare but also strangely comfortable, as if this woman had seen the worst parts of him and decided to stay anyway. "My brother died 5 years ago," he said finally, needing her to understand. "It was my fault. I started a fight trying to defend him, and he took a bullet meant for me. I have been running ever since, trying to get away from what I did, but it follows me everywhere." Penelope reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "It was not your fault," she said. "The man who pulled the gun, he is the one responsible. You were trying to protect your brother. That is not the same as causing his death." "I have been telling myself that for 5 years," Harrison said bitterly. "It does not help." "Maybe you have been telling yourself, but you have not been believing it," Penelope said. "There is a difference. Believing requires you to forgive yourself, and that is the hardest thing any of us ever has to do." Harrison looked at her for a long moment, this strange woman who seemed to see straight through him. "Who did you lose?" he asked gently. Her expression shifted, pain flickering across her features before she controlled it. "My mother died when I was 14, she said. "Cholera swept through Lewiston that summer. My father never recovered from losing her. He worked himself into an early grave trying to forget, and I watched him do it. I was 16 when he died, and I blamed myself for not being enough to make him want to live." "That was not your fault either," Harrison said, echoing her words back to her. She smiled sadly. "No, it was not. But knowing something and feeling it are different things, are they not? I have spent the last 6 years building up my father's business, proving to myself that his legacy mattered. But some nights I still wonder if I could have saved him if I had just been a better daughter." They understood each other then. These two wounded people sitting by a river in Idaho while the afternoon slipped toward evening. Harrison felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went beyond words. This woman had seen him at his lowest and had not turned away. More than that, She had offered him comfort without asking for anything in return. In a world that felt increasingly harsh and unforgiving, that kind of grace was rare enough to be precious. "Can I walk you back to town?" he asked. "It will be dark soon, and I would feel better knowing you made it home safely." Penelope studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I would like that, but you should let me finish treating those hands first. You will get an infection otherwise." She worked efficiently, wrapping his knuckles in clean cloth after applying more of her salve. Harrison watched her face as she concentrated on the task, noting the small lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested she smiled often, even if she was not smiling now. She had capable hands and a gentle touch, and he found himself wondering what it would be like to have those hands touch him in other ways, then immediately felt guilty for the thought. They walked back toward Lewiston as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Penelope told him about her work running the freight warehouse, how she had to fight every day to be taken seriously by men who thought a woman had no place in business. Harrison told her about his years as a cowboy, the long cattle drives and the beauty of open country that went on forever. He did not tell her about the nightmares that still woke him most nights, or the way he sometimes flinched at loud noises, but he sensed she understood those things without needing to hear them spoken. When they reached the edge of town, Penelope turned to him. "Will you come by the warehouse tomorrow?" she asked. "I could use someone with a strong back to help move some heavy crates, and I can pay fairly." Harrison knew what she was really offering, a reason for him to stay, a purpose that was not running. He should have said no. He should have collected his wages from the lumber camp and moved on to the next town, the next job, the next temporary escape. But something in her steady gray eyes made him want to be the kind of man who stayed. "I will be there," he said. Penelope smiled then, and it transformed her whole face, making her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness. "Good, come at 8. I will have coffee ready." He watched her walk away down the main street of Lewiston, her basket swinging from her arm, and felt something like hope stirring in his chest for the first time in years. The next morning, Harrison showed up at the warehouse exactly at 8, his hand still wrapped in Penelope's bandages. She was waiting for him with coffee as promised, served in thick ceramic mugs that warmed his palms. The warehouse was a large wooden structure near the docks where the freight boats came in, filled with crates and barrels and sacks of goods that needed to be organized and distributed. It smelled of sawdust and canvas and the river. "I need those moved to the back," Penelope said, gesturing to a stack of heavy crates near the door. "Merchant is coming this afternoon to pick them up, and I need the space cleared for a new shipment." Harrison set down his coffee and got to work. The physical labor felt good, burning off the nervous energy that always lived under his skin. Penelope worked alongside him, showing surprising strength for her frame as she helped maneuver the heavier pieces. They fell into an easy rhythm, and Harrison found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did around people. Over the next few weeks, he became a regular fixture at the warehouse. Penelope paid him fairly and fed him lunch most days. Simple meals of bread and cheese and apples that they ate sitting on crates while they talked. Harrison learned that she was fiercely independent and wickedly smart, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh. She learned that he was more educated than most cowboys, that his mother had been a schoolteacher before she died, and that he had a soft spot for stray dogs and honest work. They did not talk much more about their respective losses, but the understanding remained between them like a foundation they were building on. Harrison found himself thinking about her at odd moments when he was not at the warehouse, remembering the way she laughed, or the focused expression she got when she was calculating numbers in the account books. He caught himself wanting to tell her things, to share parts of himself he usually kept locked away. One evening, in late September, as the air turned crisp with the promise of autumn, Penelope invited him to dinner at her house. It was a small, neat place on the edge of town with a garden that she tended herself. She cooked venison stew and fresh bread, and they ate by lamplight at her kitchen table while she told him about her plans to expand the freight business into the smaller mining camps in the mountains. "You could come with me," she said suddenly, looking at him over her coffee cup. "When I make the trips up to the camps, I mean, it would be safer with two people, and I could use someone who knows how to handle himself." Harrison felt his heart beat faster. This was more than just a job offer. This was her asking him to be part of her life in a real way, to stay instead of running. "Are you sure?" he asked carefully. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Penelope said. She set down her cup and looked at him directly. "I know you are honest and hardworking. I know you have been hurt badly and are trying to heal. I know that when you look at me, you see me, not just some woman you can use or dismiss. That is more than most men offer." Harrison stood up from the table, suddenly restless with emotions he could not quite name. He walked to the window and looked out at her garden, at the neat rows of vegetables and herbs she had cultivated. Everything about her life showed care and attention, a determination to build something good from what she had been given. "I am afraid," he admitted quietly. "I am afraid that if I stay, if I let myself care about you, something terrible will happen. Everyone I have ever loved has been taken from me. My mother died of fever when I was 12. My father drank himself to death 2 years later. My brother died in my arms. I cannot go through that again." He heard her chair scrape back, then felt her presence behind him. She did not touch him, but her voice was steady. "You cannot protect yourself from loss by refusing to love," she said. "That is not living, Harrison. That is just surviving, and you deserve more than that. We both do." He turned to face her, and the look in her eyes nearly undid him. There was vulnerability there, a matching fear, but also courage. She was offering him something precious and fragile, the possibility of connection, and she was trusting him not to break it. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I have been alone for so long." "Then we will figure it out together," Penelope said. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "I am not asking for promises you cannot keep. I am just asking you to try. Stay in Lewiston. Work with me. Let us see what happens." Harrison looked down at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit perfectly between his, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. He was tired of running, tired of being alone, tired of pretending that he did not need anyone. This woman had seen him at his most broken and had offered him grace. Maybe it was time to offer himself the same. "All right," he said. "I will stay." The smile that broke across Penelope's face was worth every bit of fear he was feeling. She squeezed his hand, then pulled him into a hug that felt like coming home. Harrison wrapped his arms around her and breathed in the scent of her hair, like lavender and wood smoke, and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have this. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight while the autumn wind whispered against the windows. When they finally pulled apart, Harrison cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently, a question and a promise all at once. Penelope kissed him back, and it felt like forgiveness, like possibility, like all the things he had stopped believing in. The winter that followed was hard but good. Harrison moved into a boarding house near the warehouse and became Penelope's official business partner, though everyone in town knew he was much more than that. They made trips up into the mining camps together, hauling supplies on pack horses through snow and mud, and Harrison found a kind of peace in the work and in her company. Penelope's steady presence soothed something in him that had been raw and bleeding for years, and he realized that she had been right that first day by the river. Tears were just proof of love, and love was worth the risk of loss. They courted properly through the winter months, with Sunday dinners at her house, and walks along the frozen river and long conversations that lasted into the night. Harrison told her everything about Tommy's death, all the details he had never shared with anyone, and Penelope listened without judgment. She told him about watching her father fade away, about the loneliness of being young and responsible for a business in a town that did not take her seriously. They gave each other their wounds and found that they fit together in the broken places. Two people who understood that healing was not about forgetting, but about learning to carry the weight together. In March of 1879, when the snow began to melt and the river ran high with runoff, Harrison asked Penelope to marry him. He did it without a ring or grand gestures, just the two of them sitting on the log by the river where they had first met. He told her that he loved her, that she had given him back something he thought he had lost forever, the ability to feel without being afraid of the feeling. Penelope said yes with tears streaming down her face, and Harrison held her while she cried, grateful that he could offer her the same comfort she had given him. They were married in April in a small ceremony at the church in Lewiston, with a handful of friends and business associates in attendance. Penelope wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, and Harrison wore his best clothes, his hands shaking only slightly as he slipped the gold band onto her finger. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed her like she was the answer to every prayer he had stopped believing would be heard. Their first year of marriage was an education in trust and compromise. Penelope was used to running everything herself and had to learn to share decisions. Harrison was used to being alone and had to learn to let someone in, to accept help and affection without waiting for it to be taken away. They fought sometimes, usually about business decisions or Harrison's tendency to push himself too hard, but they always came back to each other. Always talked it through until they understood what the other person needed. The warehouse business grew steadily, and they hired 2 more men to help with the heavy labor. Harrison proved to have a good head for logistics, mapping out efficient routes to the mining camps and negotiating fair prices with merchants. Penelope handled the accounting and customer relations, her sharp mind for numbers keeping them profitable even in lean months. Together they built something solid, a life that was more than either of them could have managed alone. In the fall of 1880, Penelope told Harrison she was pregnant. He felt terror and joy in equal measure, remembering every loss he had ever suffered and terrified of losing her or the child. But Penelope took his face in her hands and made him look at her, really look at her. "I am strong," she said firmly. "I am healthy. And you are going to be a wonderful father. Do not let fear steal this from us." Harrison tried to believe her, but the months of her pregnancy were some of the hardest of his life. He hovered constantly, worrying about every little thing, until Penelope finally sat him down and told him he needed to trust her to know her own body. It was another lesson in letting go of control, in accepting that love meant risk and risk meant vulnerability. Their son was born in May of 1881, a healthy boy with Penelope's gray eyes and Harrison's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after the brother Harrison had lost, and as Harrison held his son for the first time, he felt something settle in his chest. This was not replacement or forgetting. This was honoring, continuing, choosing life even after death. Penelope recovered well from the birth, though she was tired in the early months as they adjusted to having an infant. Harrison walked the floor with Thomas at night when he cried, singing the old cowboy songs his mother had taught him and marveling at the weight of this tiny person in his arms. He had never thought he would have this, a family of his own, and the gratitude he felt was almost overwhelming. They named Thomas after Harrison's brother, but they called him Tom most of the time, a small boy with a big personality who laughed easily and explored everything with curious hands. Harrison discovered that fatherhood suited him in ways he had not expected. He was patient with Tom's endless questions, creative in his play, protective without being smothering. Penelope watched them together and saw the healing that was happening, the way Harrison was learning to love without fear. As Tom grew from infant to toddler, the warehouse business continued to expand. They opened a second location in a nearby town and hired a manager to run it, allowing them more flexibility in their own schedules. Harrison still made regular trips up to the mining camps, but now he often took Tom with him when the boy was old enough, teaching him about the mountains and the work that fed their family. Penelope ran the main warehouse with the same efficiency she had always had, though now she often had Tom playing in the corner of her office while she worked. In 1884, their daughter was born, a tiny girl with Penelope's determination written all over her face from the first moment. They named her Margaret, after Harrison's mother, and called her Maggie. Tom was 3 years old and immediately devoted to his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from feeding to diaper changing. Harrison watched his children together and felt the last of his old wounds finally close. This was what healing looked like, he realized. Not forgetting the past, but building a future that honored it. The years passed in the way years do when life is full and good, with work and children and the daily rhythms of a shared existence. Harrison and Penelope grew into their partnership, learning each other's patterns and needs, becoming a unit that functioned smoothly even in difficult times. They still had their hard days, moments when old grief surfaced or new challenges seemed overwhelming, but they had each other, and that made all the difference. Harrison never forgot that afternoon by the river when he had broken down in Penelope's arms, but he no longer felt ashamed of it. That moment had been the beginning of his healing, the first time he had allowed himself to be vulnerable and found acceptance instead of rejection. Penelope had given him permission to be fully human, with all the messy emotions that entailed, and in doing so had helped him become the man he had always wanted to be. In the summer of 1889, they took a trip back to Colorado. Harrison had not returned since Tommy's death, but he felt ready now to face that part of his past. They brought Tom and Maggie with them, 2 children who knew they were loved and safe. Harrison stood at Tommy's grave with Penelope's hand in his, and told his brother about his life, about the family he had built and the business he was running, and the woman who had saved him. He cried again, but they were different tears now, grief mixed with gratitude, loss acknowledged but not defining. "He would have liked you," Harrison told Penelope as they walked back to the hotel where they were staying. Tom ran ahead chasing a butterfly, and Maggie held her mother's other hand, chattering about everything she saw. "I think I would have liked him too," Penelope said. She leaned her head against Harrison's shoulder as they walked. "He made you who you are in a way. Your love for him, your grief for him, all of that shaped you into the man I fell in love with." Harrison kissed the top of her head, overwhelmed as always by her ability to see straight to the heart of things. "You did not fall in love with a broken cowboy by a river," he pointed out. "Yes, I did," Penelope said firmly. "I fell in love with a man who was brave enough to show me his breaking. That is not weakness, Harrison. That is strength. It takes courage to cry, to admit you need help, to let someone see you at your lowest. I knew that day that you were someone special, someone worth knowing." They returned to Lewiston with lighter hearts, ready to continue building the life they had started. The warehouse business was thriving, providing well for their family and employing several people in the community. Tom was 8 years old now and already showing an interest in the business, asking questions about inventory and freight routes. Maggie was 5 and more interested in the garden Penelope had expanded over the years, spending hours helping her mother plant seeds and tend vegetables. Harrison had learned to sleep through the night without nightmares, or at least most nights. When the bad dreams did come, Penelope was there, holding him in the dark until his breathing steadied and he remembered where he was. Safe. Loved. Home. In 1892, as Tom approached his 11th birthday and Maggie turned 8, Harrison and Penelope sat on their porch one evening watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the summer air. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked quietly. Taking a chance on a broken stranger, Penelope turned to look at him, her gray eyes still as steady as they had been that first day by the river. "Never," she said. "You were exactly who I needed, even if I did not know it at the time. We saved each other, Harrison." "That is what love does." Harrison pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. He thought about the man he had been 13 years ago, drowning in grief and guilt, convinced he was cursed to lose everyone he loved. That man would not have believed this future was possible, would not have thought he deserved a second chance at happiness. But Penelope had seen something in him worth saving, and she had offered him grace when he needed it most. She had taught him that breaking was not the end, that tears could be cleansing, that vulnerability was a gift you gave to people you trusted. She had shown him that love did not have to end in loss, that sometimes it just grew and deepened and became the foundation you built a whole life on. "I love you," he said, the words inadequate for the depth of feeling behind them. "I know," Penelope said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I love you too. Always have, from that first day when you cried in my arms and trusted me with your pain. That is when I knew you were mine." They sat together as the sun set fully and the stars began to appear. Two people who had found each other in the midst of their respective grief and built something beautiful from the broken pieces. Their children played in the gathering dusk, safe and loved and free in ways their parents had once thought impossible. Harrison Everett had spent 5 years running from his past before he found himself at a river in Idaho, broken and bleeding and ready to give up. But Penelope Sutton had been there, offering comfort without judgment, seeing strength in his tears instead of weakness. She had been the woman who could calm a crying man, and he had cried in her arms and felt no shame. That moment of vulnerability had been the beginning of everything good in his life, the first step on a journey toward healing he had not known he could take. Years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Tom grew into a young man who inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's business sense, already helping run freight routes by the time he was 16. Maggie developed her mother's quiet strength and her father's capacity for compassion, often found tending not just the garden but also helping neighbors who needed an extra pair of hands or a listening ear. In 1895, Harrison and Penelope celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home, the children having arranged to spend the night with friends so their parents could have time alone. They ate the meal Penelope had prepared, venison roast with vegetables from the garden, and talked about everything and nothing the way couples do when they know each other completely. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Harrison asked as they cleared the dishes together. "About how believing required forgiving yourself," Penelope smiled, handing him a plate to dry. "I remember. You looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language." I had never thought of it that way, Harrison admitted. I had been so focused on the guilt, on what I thought I had done wrong, that I never considered I might deserve forgiveness. You gave me that, Pen. You gave me permission to forgive myself. She set down the dish she was washing and turned to face him, her hands still damp. After 16 years of marriage, she was still beautiful to him, though her face now carried the marks of time and experience. There were lines around her eyes from years of squinting at account books and smiling at her children. Her hair had a few strands of silver woven through the dark. But her eyes were the same, that steady gray that had seen straight through him from the beginning. You gave yourself permission, she corrected gently. I just held space for you while you found it. That is all any of us can do for the people we love, Harrison. We cannot heal their wounds for them, but we can be present while they heal themselves. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face in her hair. She still smelled like lavender and wood smoke, a scent that would always mean home to him. I do not know what I did to deserve you, he murmured. You showed up, Penelope said simply. You stayed. You did the hard work of healing. That is all anyone can ask. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the kitchen while the lamps flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. This was what love looked like after 16 years, Harrison thought. Not the passionate intensity of new romance, but something deeper and steadier. A knowing. A trust built day by day through shared struggles and small kindnesses. A partnership that had weathered storms and come out stronger. Tom married in 1898 at the age of 17 to a girl from one of the mining camps. A sweet-natured young woman named Catherine, who shared his interest in the freight business. Harrison watched his son say his vows and felt pride mixed with the bittersweet recognition that his children were growing up, building their own lives. But there was no fear in it anymore, no terror that loving meant losing. He had learned that love expanded to include new people, new generations. It did not diminish. It multiplied. Maggie proved to have her mother's independent streak and her father's wanderlust. At 15, she announced her intention to study nursing, wanting to help people the way her mother had helped her father all those years ago. Harrison and Penelope supported her ambitions, proud of the strong young woman their daughter had become. They arranged for her to apprentice with the doctor in town, and Maggie threw herself into learning with characteristic determination. In the spring of 1900, Tom and Catherine had their first child, a baby girl they named Penelope after her grandmother. Harrison held his granddaughter and felt the circle complete itself, the continuation of life after loss, love after grief. He thought of Tommy, the brother he had lost so long ago, and silently told him about this new generation, this family that carried his name forward. Penelope Everett, both grandmother and namesake, watched her husband with their granddaughter and felt her heart swell. She had been right to trust her instincts that day by the river 22 years ago. Harrison had been worth the risk, worth the vulnerability of opening her own wounded heart. Together they had built something lasting, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The warehouse business continued to grow, now being run primarily by Tom with Harrison serving as advisor. At 46, Harrison found he enjoyed the slower pace, the ability to spend more time at home with Penelope and take on only the projects that interested him. He still made occasional trips up to the mining camps, but now it was more for the pleasure of the journey than out of necessity. Maggie completed her nursing training, and at 18, married a young doctor who had come to Lewiston to set up practice. His name was James Carmichael, and he was a good man who respected Maggie's skills and intelligence. Harrison gave his daughter away at her wedding with tears in his eyes, remembering the tiny infant she had been, the curious toddler, the determined young woman she had become. Penelope squeezed his hand during the ceremony, understanding without words what he was feeling. In the fall of 1902, Harrison turned 48, and Penelope threw him a surprise party at the house they had lived in for over 20 years. Their children and grandchildren were there, along with friends from the business and the community. Harrison stood in the middle of the celebration, surrounded by the life he had built, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had gone home and they were cleaning up the remnants of the party, Harrison pulled Penelope into his arms and kissed her deeply. "Thank you," he said when they broke apart. "For the party?" she asked, smiling. "For everything," Harrison said. "For seeing me when I could not see myself. For staying when I gave you every reason to leave. For building this life with me. For loving me even when I did not know how to love myself." Penelope cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the lines time had carved around his eyes. "You have always been easy to love, Harrison Everett," she said softly. "From that very first day when you cried in my arms, you have been easy to love. You just needed to believe you deserved it." "I believe it now," Harrison said, and it was true. After more than 2 decades of her steady presence, he finally, fully believed that he was worthy of the love she offered, that he deserved the happiness they had created together. They finished cleaning in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the ease of long practice. When they finally went to bed, Harrison held Penelope close and thanked whatever force of fate or luck or divine intervention had brought him to that river in Idaho on a September afternoon in 1878. He had been broken and bleeding and lost, and she had found him. She had offered him grace, and in accepting it, he had learned to offer it to himself. The years that followed brought their share of challenges, as years always do. There were hard winters and lean business periods. There was illness and worry and the inevitable losses that come with time. But Harrison and Penelope faced everything together, their partnership unshakable after so many years. They had learned that love was not about avoiding pain, but about choosing to face it together, about holding each other through the hard times and celebrating the good. In 1907, as Harrison approached his 53rd birthday, he and Penelope took a long postponed trip to the coast. They had always wanted to see the ocean, and now, with the business running smoothly under Tom's management and their children grown and settled, they finally had the freedom to go. They traveled by train to Oregon and stood on the beach at sunset, watching waves crash against the rocks while seabirds wheeled overhead. "It is beautiful," Penelope said, her hand tight in Harrison's. "Yes," he agreed, but he was not looking at the ocean. He was looking at her, this woman who had shaped his life in ways he could never have imagined. She was 51 now, her hair more silver than dark, her face marked by time and experience. But to him, she was as beautiful as she had been that first day, standing on the riverbank with her basket of herbs and her steady gray eyes. They stayed at the coast for a week, exploring tide pools and walking the beaches, talking about everything and nothing. It was a second honeymoon of sorts, a chance to remember who they were outside of parents and business owners and community members. They were just Harrison and Penelope, 2 people who had found each other and chosen each other every day since. On their last night at the coast, they sat on the beach watching the sun set over the water. Harrison thought about the man he had been when Penelope found him, drowning in grief and guilt, convinced he was cursed. That man would not recognize the life he was living now, the peace he had found, the family he had helped create. "I used to think happiness was something that happened to other people," he said quietly. "I thought I was too broken, too cursed, too damaged. But you taught me that happiness is something you build day by day, choice by choice. You taught me that being broken does not mean being worthless, That vulnerability is strength. That love is worth the risk. Penelope leaned her head on his shoulder, her arm linked through his. "We taught each other," she said. "I was just as broken when you found me, Harrison, just as alone and convinced I did not deserve more. We healed together. That is the gift we gave each other, the permission to be fully human, wounds and all." They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began to appear. Two people who had built a life from the broken pieces of their pasts. Behind them, in Lewiston, their children and grandchildren were living the lives they had helped make possible, carrying forward the legacy of love and resilience. Harrison Everett had cried in Penelope Sutton's arms on a September afternoon in 1878, and she had held him without judgment. That moment had changed everything, had set him on a path toward healing he had not known was possible. She had been the woman who could calm a crying man, and in calming him, had taught him that tears were not weakness but strength, that vulnerability was not shameful but sacred. They returned to Lewiston a week later, tanned from the sun and renewed by their time away. Life continued its steady rhythm, with work and family and the daily joys and challenges of living. More grandchildren were born, the warehouse business expanded into new territories, and Harrison and Penelope grew older together with grace and gratitude. In 1912, on their 33rd wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch of the house they had shared for so many years. Tom and Catherine lived nearby with their 3 children, and Maggie and James had just welcomed their second child. The evening was warm, with fireflies beginning to appear in the garden as the light faded. 33 years, Penelope said, shaking her head in wonder. "It feels like yesterday and forever all at once." Harrison took her hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her skin. "Best 33 years of my life," he said simply. "Mine too," Penelope agreed. She looked at him, her gray eyes still steady after all these years. "You know what I remember most about that first day?" "What?" "The way you tried to hide your tears at first, like they were something to be ashamed of. And then, when you finally let go, the relief on your face. You looked like someone who had been holding their breath for years and finally remembered how to breathe." Harrison nodded slowly, remembering that moment with perfect clarity. "That is exactly what it felt like," he said. "Like I had been suffocating and you gave me air. You saved my life, Pen. Not in some dramatic way, but in all the small, daily ways that matter. You gave me back myself. And you gave me purpose," Penelope said. "I was so focused on proving I could run the business alone, on being strong enough to need no one. You taught me that needing people is not weakness. That letting someone in does not diminish you, it completes you." They sat in comfortable silence as night fell fully, the fireflies dancing in the garden like earth-bound stars. Inside the house, the lamps were lit, casting warm light through the windows. This was home, Harrison thought. Not just the physical structure, but everything it represented. Years of shared history, of fights and reconciliations, of laughter and tears, of building something lasting from nothing but hope and determination. As they prepared for bed that night, Harrison caught sight of their reflection in the mirror. 2 people in their late 50s, marked by time but still recognizably themselves, still together, still choosing each other. He thought of all the versions of himself that had existed over the years. The grief-stricken 19-year-old who lost his brother, the running cowboy trying to outrun his past, the broken man crying by a river, the husband and father and grandfather he had become. Penelope had known and loved all those versions, had seen him at his worst and his best and everything in between. That was the real gift of a long marriage, he realized. Not that your partner only saw your good sides, but that they saw all of you and chose to stay anyway. They lived out their days in Lewiston, growing old together with the kind of contentment that comes from a life well lived. Their children thrived, carrying forward the values they had been taught about hard work and compassion and the importance of vulnerability. Their grandchildren grew up hearing stories about how their grandparents had met, about the cowboy who cried, and the woman who held him without judgment. Harrison Everett died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1920 at the age of 66, Penelope beside him as she had been for 42 years. His last words to her were the same ones he had spoken countless times throughout their marriage. "Thank you for seeing me." Penelope mourned him deeply, but without regret. They had built a good life together, had loved each other fully and without reservation. She had given him permission to be vulnerable, and he had given her permission to need someone. Together they had proven that broken people could heal, that love could triumph over loss, that choosing to stay was sometimes the bravest thing you could do. She lived another 5 years, watching her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren be born. She continued to run the warehouse until the end, her mind sharp and her determination undiminished. When she finally passed in the spring of 1925, her children buried her next to Harrison under the pines overlooking the river where they had first met. Their story became part of Lewiston's history, passed down through generations as an example of what love could be when two people were brave enough to be vulnerable with each other. The woman who could calm a crying man and the cowboy who cried in her arms without shame, building a life from tears and trust, and the daily choice to keep choosing each other, no matter what came.